Today is Pentecost. I think it's the one day of the year we get the red. I like the red. It's Pentecost, and that means we have an interesting mashup, as we would say in England, of two stories. One involving hearing, and one involving seeing. They are different stories, but in a way they are also connected, since it is the work of God in both stories that allows the sight and sound to become a reality. In the story of Pentecost, the miracle is instantaneous. There is a mighty rushing wind as the Holy Spirit comes in and fills the place where the believers are meeting. It must have sounded something like a tornado, because when all the other people in the city heard it, they come running to see what has happened. And there are the disciples with these tongues of fire dancing above their heads. And the disciples begin to preach the gospel. And all these foreign people that are there in the city start hearing the gospel in their own languages simultaneously. A miracle of understanding. Immediate. By contrast, the healing of the man born blind takes a little time to be realized. Jesus spits on the ground, makes some mud with the saliva, and puts it on the man's eyes. Then he tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. And by the time the man has done it, he can see. A miracle of sight in a bit of a roundabout way. It's another English thing. Must have been in an English mood this week. Still, both of these stories are about miracles, physical sight and sound. Yet, as is so often the case where God is working, there is another layer to these stories, a spiritual layer. The thing that initially amazes people is the physical sight and sound. But the question lingers, will there also be spiritual sight and sound? That is not so readily apparent. As we've seen over the last couple of weeks with the story of the blind man, the Pharisees were not having any of it. Eventually, there was absolutely no question that the man who could now see had been born blind. And there was no question what the implications of that miracle were in terms of what it meant about who Jesus was, or whose power he was operating with. But in the end, it seems they refused to see what they could plainly see. Jesus had no problem restoring the physical sight, but restoring the spiritual sight of those Pharisees, at least, was not a foregone conclusion. And it was also that way in our Pentecost story. Have you ever noticed that in that story? Now, we don't know if some of these people who came on the day of Pentecost were Pharisees or not, but when the people from around the city rushed into where the disciples were and heard them speaking in their native languages, not everyone was impressed. Acts 2 verse 13 says, there were others in the crowd who ridiculed them and said, they're just drunk. Now after that, which is part of the chapter we didn't read this morning, after that, Peter steps up and gives this eloquent defense of his brothers in the faith before proceeding to lay out the gospel message. And there was a massive response. 3,000 people were baptized that day. Yet, verse 41 seems to indicate that this might not have represented all who were there, since it says, those who believed what Peter said were baptized. It's yet another incredible example of God's amazing gift of freedom. Or perhaps another sad example of some people's unbelievable curse of stubbornness. But just because God brings the light and the sound doesn't mean we must choose to see or hear. We can refuse to see. We can refuse to hear. But just because there will be those who choose to stay in their darkness and silence, that doesn't mean we shouldn't celebrate those who come into the light. It's a beautiful thing to see. Almost 3,000 baptized in a single day on Pentecost. Can you imagine? We marvel at those kind of mass numbers. But I think the beautiful thing about God is that we see that He will go to all the same trouble to win even just one person, like in the story of the man born blind. God can easily restore every aspect of our physical lives, and I think that's why He gives the most attention to our spiritual lives. I think we see how it so beautifully unfolds in the story of the blind man. So let's take a few moments to think about the spiritual journey of awakening that this man went on. Often in the Bible, we see the opposite. We see some people's spiritual journey into darkness as they get more and more stubborn. This man has the opposite experience, opening up to the light, and it's very beautiful to see. The man has his physical sight, right? No problem. That is taken care of. But now, we get to watch as his spiritual sight is restored step by step as he deals with the aftermath of the unexpected miracle he has received. And he ends up on a journey of 5 conversations, each one giving the man clearer insight into who Jesus is, and each one strengthening his courage and resolve in the truth. He will not back down. He will not be dissuaded. He is determined to see. In the first conversation, his neighbors and acquaintances are quarreling with each other, wondering sort of aloud if this guy is the same blind beggar they all knew, and he insists that it's him. So in verse 10, they ask, well, who healed you? What happened? And he tells them, the man they call Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes. That's very interesting. At this point, Jesus is just the man. Right? He really doesn't know anything about him other than his name and what he did for him. Now, we're not told why these people then took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees, but that's what happened next. And it resulted in the second conversation. The man repeated what had happened to the Pharisees, and it sort of sets off this firestorm of controversy. Some of them say that Jesus can't be from God since he's not properly keeping the Sabbath. But others say, well, there's no way Jesus could open the eyes of a man born blind without God's power. So in verse 17, the Pharisees ask the man what he thinks. And the man replies, I think he must be a prophet. Again, very interesting. Something has happened to the man while he's been listening to the Pharisees argue back and forth. It has made him think about the miracle and the man who performed it in a bit of a different light. And so when the Pharisees asked for his opinion, we see that Jesus has gotten an upgrade from an ordinary man to a man sent by God, a prophet. Well, of course, that only inflamed matters, and sensing that they weren't going to get so far with this man, the Pharisees sought out his parents, and the third conversation ensued. But beyond acknowledging that the man is their son and that he was indeed born blind, they don't say much of anything else because John tells us they were afraid of the Pharisees. That's not to dog the parents. It would have been no small thing to oppose the prevailing wisdom of the religious elite. And let me assure you, 2,000 years later, it's still no small thing to oppose the prevailing wisdom of the religious elite. In that sense, the parents are like Nicodemus, who was at least open to the truth about Jesus, but he wasn't there going to seek him out in broad daylight. And if anything, it makes the blind man's courage all the more incredible. You know, his parents might be sort of cautiously headed down the path of belief in Jesus, but their son is already rounding the bend ahead and starting to sprint. This leads into the fourth conversation, perhaps the most spectacular and unbelievable conversation between the Pharisees and a regular guy. The only other person I can think of who ever spoke to the Pharisees like this was Jesus. But by this time, the time he's called back in for another round of conversation, the blind man had obviously grown very bold in the truth, and he, mere beggar, is openly provoking the most educated people in the land. This is what we call poking the bear. In verse 24, the Pharisees say, God should get the glory for this, because we know this man is a sinner. This is throwing the gauntlet down. Do you hear the veiled threat there? You glorify God, sir, by calling Jesus a sinner. If you refuse to glorify God, we will excommunicate you from the synagogue. How would you respond to such a threat? This blind man is my hero. Until we were studying the story, I've never given him much thought. You know, we pulled up Moses and Daniel and all these other heroes of faith. This blind man has it going on. He is my hero. His comeback are his most famous words. Well, whether he's a sinner or not, I really couldn't tell. But one thing I am sure of, I used to be blind and now I can see. Wow! Do you see how he's just hammering that nail in? The truth, they have already acknowledged that nobody could do a miracle like this if they weren't from God. One thing is evident. The truth has sunk down very deeply and very quickly into this man's heart, and it has taken root. Imagine standing up to these formidable leaders in this way. And what's more, on the heels of that zinger came another one. I've already had this conversation with you once. Why do you want to hear it again? Oh, do you want to become his disciples too? And as if that weren't enough, the man just keeps going right on. Oh, what a strange thing, he says, that you can't tell where he's from, considering that he opened my eyes. In all history, no one has ever heard of someone's opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't do a thing. Wow! Can you just hear the duh at the end of that? And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. It is simply amazing what has happened in this man's heart. But the Pharisees couldn't stand it. So they humiliated him, and they threw him out of the synagogue. And the sad reality is evident. Throughout the course of these 4 conversations, the blind man was seeing more and more clearly, and the blindness of the Pharisees was hardening, getting darker and darker. And so we come to the 5th and final conversation. And what's so wonderful about this conversation is that Jesus initiates it. The man has been expelled from his people, his lifelong spiritual community. But Jesus finds him. And in that encounter, the man finds a new spiritual home. When Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man and asked, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" The man answered, "Who is he, sir? I want to believe in him." "You have seen him," Jesus said, like what he did there, "and he is speaking to you." "Yes, Lord, I believe," the man said, and he worshipped Jesus. And that's the last we hear of this man. But what an incredible journey. From calling Jesus a man, to believing him to be a prophet, to worshiping him as God. His faith came at a great personal cost, but he gained far more than he ever lost. He not only gained physical sight, he received spiritual sight. Oh, how Jesus would have loved to give the same sight to the Pharisees. But they would not see. It's not that they could not see. They would not see. And on the great day of Pentecost, nearly 3,000 received their spiritual sight. We don't know how many that day decided they would not see. Hopefully it wasn't many. But the truth of Pentecost is still the truth today. That God is the only sight and sound there is. Without him, we do not see. Without him, we do not hear. If we refuse to see his light, there will be no light for us to see. And if we refuse to hear his truth, there will be no truth for us to hear. But if we are willing, the opening of our physical eyes and ears will only be the first step in a journey of discovery that will lead us to abundant spiritual life and an enthusiastic welcome into a brand new community of faith. May we receive the eyes to truly see and the ears to truly hear. Amen.